Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the Writers Podcast. Today, I have with me guest writer, author, and educator, Don Sawyer. G'day, Don.
Hi, very nice to be on your show, Lou. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, I appreciate you coming on. And I'm going to ask you, maybe you've had this question asked you before, but you're not related to Robert J. Sawyer in any way, are you?
No, I met Robert Sawyer once or
Okay.
twice at conferences, but no, we're no relation.
Okay. I just wanted to get that out of the way. I'm pretty sure you weren't, but I don't know. I thought maybe he's a cousin or an uncle or something. I don't know, but okay, that's good. So your latest book is The Burning Gem,
Burning Gem.
and it's going to be the first book in a series called the Soul Catcher series, correct?
Exactly.
All righty. Do you want to give a quick? Do you have your elevator pitch for that?
I was just going to say, I just happen to have a picture right here.
Awesome. So there you go.
Yeah, it's a real departure for me.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen from my bio. I've had 12 or 14 books in all different genres.
Right.
This is an urban fantasy, and it's an area I've always really been fascinated with. Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite authors.
Okay.
So many, and of course, people that I really, when I grew up, I guess I grew up with Tolkien, and he was sort of my alternate universe that allowed me to keep a pretty repressive suburban life. And so that ability to create worlds and transport readers into them has always been something that fascinated me. But most of the stuff I've written up to this point has been either nonfiction, like I started teaching in Newfoundland in 1970 in a rural outport, and that was a nonfiction account of that, and several young adult novels, some children's work, all kinds of things like that. Tom Wayman, who is a poet in Canada, said he wants on his tombstone, well, at least he got a book out of it. And that's kind of the way my life is unfolded. As incidents and events occur, they get incorporated into my writing.
Okay. So I'm sorry if I missed it, but what's the pitch for your book?
Oh, that's right. The pitch for the book. Yeah. Well, so the intro there was, this is a whole new genre for me. But I was actually living inexplicably in Alabama for a time, and I was part of a writers group, and I really wanted to try something new, a new departure. And so I had heard, and as you have no doubt, that when some of the attempts to record through photography the sort of the last days of Amerindian life, particularly with guys like Curtis, many of the Indians were very reluctant to have their pictures taken because they saw that they were afraid that either part of themselves were captured in the box camera, these big wood box cameras. Or I would prefer to think that they understood that this froze them unrealistically at a time and place when in fact their lives continued. And so it caught the soul in a way. So it was a term that's always been kind of in the back of my mind that I've fooled around with. And so I thought, well, what if there really was a machine that could take a part of your soul and not put it on a print, but encapsulate it into a gem, a stone, a magnificent stone. And so literally part of you was in that stone. But then of course, that would be sort of just passive. But what if that stone was not only made by forces who were interested in evil ends, but using it to accelerate certain tendencies within your character and your personality, particularly those toward greed, control, disrespect of others, fear of the other, tribalism. So those things would be promoted, and those people who we would now probably call influencers would begin to have an impact on society as a whole. Well, so I create this world that involves agents that create these gems for a character called the Mester. Turns out is located in London, but they have no idea what these stones are for, how they're
Mm.
used. They have their own, and those are being kept hostage in London. But at the same time, each one, and he only chooses men because they're easier to control. The Mester does chooses his agents, and the agents are also devastated. They've all had terrible tragedies, and they have no reason to live. And this guy kind of throws them a lifeline. So they live these lives of opulent emptiness. They're not allowed to give their names. They're not allowed to touch other people. They're not allowed to have any relationships, so as long as they're carrying out this role.
Mm.
And so it's so we run into this guy as he's crystallized a part of the soul of a young woman in a suburb of New York, who's living this empty life in a suburban hollow shell with a philandering husband who's desperate to get out. And we don't
Okay.
know why. We don't know why he finds her. We don't know why he comes to her door, but she manages to get the gem, and it's so magical and so it's so transformative, that she realizes this is her way out. She's got to find this guy, and he's got to, this is her. This is her hole out of this mess she's in. So
Okay.
we follow her then as she tracks this guy down by walking through. I won't go into too much, but walking through the subways of New York to an abandoned station,
Mm.
and
Okay.
and he of course is shocked and terrified because the retribution for breaking all of these rules is awful,
Mm.
death so the conflict begins, and can she break through his shell, and
Mm.
together and they find what's really behind these gems and this cabal, this evil cabal that's it. And so their trip takes them to Budapest, Hungary, because it turns out that the Mester is Hungarian, and so is the gem maker, who, by the way, is 110 years old,
Mm.
because um, they age slowly. The gem maker very, very slowly. They're kind of frozen themselves. Um,
Okay.
so emotionally and physically, they're frozen. So it's this odd relationship between this fiery-haired Aries woman who's desperate
Mm-hmm.
to get out of this stupid relationship she found herself in, and this 110-year-old completely lonely, empty, desperate man. And
Right.
can they find their own salvation at the same time they stop this cabal?
Mm-hmm. Sounds like you've got a real opposites attract dynamic going on with this story.
Yeah,
Uh,
initially, particularly, and then over the time, when they start to rely on each other, and they begin to see that each of their future is in the other person.
okay. Well, that's sounds like you've built up quite the world and background for it, and it sounds like a great launching pad for a series for sure. So we'll come back to that, but let's delve a little bit more into you. You have such a quite an interesting background. You've done a lot of traveling. As you said, you were an educator. Uh, did you? And you mentioned Neil Gaiman was one of your favorite writers. So I assume growing up you were a voracious reader.
Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Again, maybe I identify with Barbara, who's living in this sort of empty suburb. Mine was an
Mm-hmm.
empty suburb of Detroit, but it was still pretty empty. And so,
Okay.
so reading, when I was with a publisher and I had a bunch of books out, she had a slogan that said, "Reading takes you places," and
Right.
I always like that because it does, and it can, and anybody who's a reader knows that at some point. Well, Ursula Le Guin had something really interesting to say. She said, for a moment when you're reading, you become psychotic because you lose connection with reality, right? You're living in
Right.
an
Yeah.
alternate reality,
Yeah.
and I think that's true. On really successful books, other ones you can read.
Right. So who are some of the writers that transported
That
you to other places?
transported me. Well, I just read Cloud Cuckoo Land. I'm
Okay.
familiar with that, and I found that one of those books that just completely riveted me. Had
Is
me,
that David Mitchell? Or
I'm
uh,
awful. have to find it. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
don't remember.
Yeah,
Oh,
I've heard of the book because I've read I think it's him. And I've read his other books. Bone Clocks was one that I really enjoyed.
all the
Uh,
things we cannot see. Uh,
yeah,
yeah. Anyway,
yeah.
I shouldn't. That's it. But I mean, as far as writers go, like I say, Ursula Le Guin, Barbara Kingsolver is absolutely one of my favorite writers. I mean,
She
Poison.
does fantasy, I believe.
No, no.
No.
She just her new book is Demon Copperhead. Uh,
Okay.
I think that just but she also did some wonderful. What she did, the Poisonwood Bible. She is a fabulous American writer, and just
Okay. So what genre is she?
she's
Crime?
contemporary fiction,
Okay.
and
All right.
each one takes you someplace, and
Mm-hmm.
but
Very good. Yeah.
not off the planet.
Right. Any
Uh,
other writers?
Well, there's a woman I'm sorry that we don't hear more about. A woman named Leslie Marmon Silko. She's a
Mm,
Pueblo Indian woman who wrote a book that was one of those that really took me into another world, and it was called Ceremony. And
mm,
it's the overlay is that these witches are using uranium to plan the destruction of the world, of the globe,
wow.
and
Okay.
and this ceremony to do this is going on, and the only person who can stop it is, interestingly enough, a guy who's half Pueblo and half white. Um,
Mm,
he can work in both worlds, but he sees this going on. But of course, he's dealing with his own demons as well, and so
mm.
it's like it's like a race to see, is he able to stop this ceremony before he implodes himself. Those
Okay.
kinds of books I think really affect me deeply, and I just those books, as I say, take you somewhere else, right?
Right.
They
How about when you were growing up? What kind of?
like Tolkien. I mean, I probably read all three of his books, many,
Hmm.
many times. Um, when I was younger, I really liked the Hardy Boys. I
Yeah.
think I
Yeah.
read every one,
Yeah.
and because those were fun books. I
Yeah.
can remember when I was really young, I went to the library, of course, the Birmingham Library.
Sure.
Geez, I
Yeah.
found these books. They're called the Hardy Boys. Someone kind of looks down at my notes. We do not carry those in the library.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
um,
what genres do you like to read? Fantasy,
yeah, more
crime, science
I mean, fiction,
fiction?
fantasy. Like I say, Ursula Le Guin's work, like Left-Handed Darkness,
Right.
magnificent book,
Yeah.
magnificent book.
Yeah.
I like some of the urban fantasy. Some of it I'm not that crazy about.
Mm,
Like some of it seems to me is overly simplified. To me, urban fantasy offers you an amazing opportunity to reflect on our own world, because
right.
this alternate world just beneath our feet, right? Literally, in my case.
Sure.
And so it can be like a mirror image, but too
Yep.
often it seems like people don't use it for that purpose. They use it instead to kind of spin off some dragon tale, and
Right.
I hey, they sell, but what I mean, and then talking about selling, I love the Harry Potter books. I thought they were fantastic.
Right. Yep.
uh, I'm reading my grandson now, books that I read my kids, that were done. The Black Cauldron. Oh gosh, what
Mm,
his name? It was a whole series, and he was writing, back in the '60s and '70s. So
right.
it's interesting to see what my grandkids are reading now. But they're sure different from what I read and
Right.
what I had available to me.
Yeah. Here's this might be a deep dive for you, but have you ever read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I like Stephen King. I read
Hmm.
the first one of the Dark Tower, and I said, "No, I don't think this is for me." Uh, I
That's the
like
hardest book to get through. Yeah.
the first one.
Yeah.
You I mean, I liked the character and I liked the concept. I just couldn't,
Yeah.
get into it. Like
That's a common complaint people had. I would highly recommend trying the second book, The
okay,
Drawing of the Three, and then if that doesn't work for you, then it's not going to work for you. But that's much more in his what we've come to accept as his normal writing. I think
yeah,
Dark Tower or the Gunslinger, he was just trying to be too um, literate, and that's just not his style of writing. So
It felt,
I highly recommend you try the second book again. And I'm a big Stephen King fan, as you can see from
and
my
I am too.
bookshelf over there. But
What was
yeah,
the one that's where the kids are taken away by, I can't remember right now, the institution, and
yep,
they're, woo,
yeah,
I mean, that's that one really cooked for me.
yeah,
I
cool,
really that one every inch of the
yeah.
way. Um,
Okay, so you've got all these writers that you've been reading. At what point did you get the bug to write yourself?
okay, as I say, most of my work has come out of some experience. My first book
Hmm.
was about teaching in Newfoundland, and
Okay.
I'm so it's called Tomorrow at
So you have
School.
to, yeah, yeah, over, yeah, a little more. There you go. Cool. Yep.
There,
There it is. Yep. Done,
and
sir. Tomorrow's school.
it's
Cool.
a nonfiction account of these two young, idealistic, teachers
Hmm.
wandering into this small remote outport in Newfoundland, and trying to figure out how to teach. I had never had a teaching course in those days. Newfoundland was pretty desperate for teachers. They hired
Hmm.
me. They were
Mm.
that desperate. They hired and my wife, and it was this magical experience in a community. They'd only
Mhm.
had roads for 9 years.
Mm.
They they only had power. So this was really a community that was um, uh, had this immediate continuity with 200 years of history and
Mm.
culture and way of life that was based on the sea and fishing. And we moved in, and up until the time we were there, very few people graduated from high school because there was no need to. You
Mhm.
learned from your mother or your father what needed to be done in the community to
Right.
build.
What, time period are we talking here?
70 to 72,
70, 72, okay.
a long time ago. In,
Mm.
in fact, I still stay in touch with some of my students, and
Cool.
yeah, they brought me back for the ministry brought me back for a, a presentation about 3 or 4 years ago, and I got together with 5 of my former students, which was pretty wild.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah.
They weren't a lot younger than I was, but anyway, the point is that was a story I felt needed to be told.
Mhm.
And I'd also written a bunch of letters to people, and they said, "Man, you got to build on this." And
Mhm.
so I didn't have any confidence in my ability to write a whole book. But fortunately, I mentioned Tom Wayman, who's been a real mentor as well as a friend.
Oh,
He said,
okay.
"You can do it." So
Mhm.
I did it, and and it was picked up by publisher Douglas and McIntyre. Relatively, I realize now, relatively quickly, and it went on to be a Canadian bestseller and used widely in teacher training courses across the country, which was really gratifying.
I bet. Yeah,
So,
that's
so that was
awesome.
like at that point, I said, "Geez, maybe I can write." Um, but but it was always something that that, for example, another book I wrote, which again became a Canadian bestseller, was a nonfiction, a young adult book about working in a Canadian Indigenous community and in the
Mm.
schools and dealing with the issues that so many young uh, Native people face, like suicide and alcoholism, and that was used widely in Aboriginal schools across Canada, and
Mhm.
and it was so gratifying to get feedback from the students themselves who would write and say, like, this is the first book I've ever read, because
Right.
it was relevant, and I enjoyed it, and it really spoke to me in my life experiences. So then
Mm.
I did another one, like, for example, I did two Miss Flint books, and they were stories that I told my kids about this dastardly teacher I had when I was in grade 2, and of course I embellished the stories considerably. Um, but, so that so my daughters at one point said, "Okay, Dad, you got to write these down." So they got me a book, and I wrote the first group of Miss Flint stories, and that did really quite well. And then I brought out a second one, and that was really fun.
Right. Right. Very cool. So, at what point did you make the leap from YA to adult novels?
Well, I'm not sure when in any kind of a particular linear fashion. In my first,
Oh.
this is my, I did two YA novels, another one for a slightly younger group called Running. I did some kid stuff in between, including one called The Lunch Bag Chronicles, because when my kids were young, every day I would make them a lunch bag joke. I would illustrate it. So I had like 1,000 of these things, right?
Right.
And that was really fun. Um,
Right.
I guess this is technically my first adult fiction.
Okay.
The young adult fiction came earlier. The adult nonfiction was the first thing that I had done.
Okay. And did you find the transition to writing adult um, challenging?
Well, that's interesting. I don't think so. I had written a series of books. I taught adult education at Okanagan College for many years, and
Okay.
uh, there were there's a there's a whole group of learners who missed school, maybe
Hmm.
to work early, maybe they could, and whatever, they came from a background that didn't promote schooling, and so
Okay.
we had a very extensive adult education program, but there were almost no reading materials for that group, who were
Hmm.
maybe reading at a grade 3 or 4 level. And so I wrote a series of books, two of them based on the lives of my students, that were pretty neat novels, but they were, adult themes, adult lives,
Hmm.
adult issues. The thing about it is you had to be careful, um, to maintain the reading level. So the sentences were short, multi-syllable words were rare,
Hmm.
paragraphs were relatively short, but the stories had the same kind of arc, right?
Okay.
And the challenge was to develop characters, with a lot of embellishment, without a lot of embellishment, and to try
Hmm.
to get your settings right without a whole lot of, over descriptive. So that was a really good training ground for me. Like, just stay with
Sure.
the bones of the story. And then I did two mystery stories much on the same line. And so I had that experience of working, but not in sort of full blown. So with this,
Hmm.
I think the difference was I felt more able, to say what I wanted to say, describe what I wanted to describe without the limitations of a specific reading level.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like the shackles were
The
taken
shadows
off.
were off, yeah.
Right.
With
Now,
those words, mind you.
right. Now you've been writing for a long time. How has your process changed? Like when you started out, I don't know, did you use a typewriter or did you do longhand? Like, and now are you on a computer? Like how has that evolved for you?
Oh, that's really funny, 'cause I still have my first manuscript for, tomorrow at school. It's all written on yellow, legal
Legal?
pad.
Right.
My wife, my long-suffering wife of 55 years, was the only one who could read my writing, so she typed it out, and,
Right.
uh, but, the editing in under those circumstances was really difficult.
Sure.
I used to take, when I was doing presentations to kids on the writing process, I would
Hmm.
take this in and say, look, and then because you can see things scratched out, and you see pages stuck in, and
Hmm.
things on the column, and so that was a very different process. And
Hmm.
as I went on, I was an early adopter of computers just because my writing was so awful. Uh,
Much to your wife's relief.
still the only person who can read my writing, and I still made her proofread because anyway,
Right.
she's my best editor. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, I know it's a really interesting point. And as far as the process goes, I mean, I was working full time. Fortunately, I sure as hell wasn't relying on my
Hmm.
writing income. We would
Right.
all starve to death. Um, and so I was writing when I could. Um,
Hmm.
like when I wrote Where the Rivers Meet, my kids were young, and I would put them to bed and read them a story, and it'd be like 9 o'clock, and
Yeah.
I'd write from like 9 to midnight.
Hmm.
That's when I had time, and then I'd get up the next day and teach, and then I'd come home, and so that was a very challenging way to write, and
Hmm.
I found it wasn't until later when I had blocks of time that
Right.
and maybe that's again why a book like this is a little bit easier to attack now.
Okay. And uh, in writing The Burning Gem, what was your writing routine? Did you write during a certain time of day? Did you have a word count? How do you go about that?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I'm a little ashamed to say it, but I've been writing this over a period of about 8 years. Uh,
Okay.
and I don't mean that I was working at it 24/7 or anything,
Sure.
but um, I was fortunate to be working with a very talented group of writers and a writers group, and we had to write, and we presented our writing and got feedback.
Hmm.
So got me off on a really solid foundation.
Good.
Once I left Alabama and that group, I was more on my own.
Mhm.
But at that point, I had a pretty good idea of where the story was going. The
Mhm.
the the characters were pretty well formulated, and in basic terms, and so it was really helpful to then be able to write when I could, and
Mhm.
that I didn't have a friend. This friend of mine, Tom Wayman, he gets up in the morning, has breakfast. He writes from 9 to 12. He works in the garden from 12 to 1:30. Writes from 1:30 to 5. That's
Mhm.
not. I often write late at night.
Mm.
I'm really into it. Sometimes really late at night. Like 1, 2, 3 in the morning.
Mm.
Uh, it's like any writer. You're trying to get from point A to point B using only words. It's quite a
Yeah.
challenge, and
Yeah.
sometimes that flow, you don't want to interrupt it. And you just keep.
Mhm.
Other times
Yeah.
it's like pulling teeth, right? Screw it, I'll do it tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Very good. Now, turning back to your Burning Gem book, you did mention off the top that it's part of a series. Do you envision how many books are going to be in the series?
Well, this particular story arc is two books,
Okay.
uh, but the foundation is laid now for at least a third. The
Okay.
the part of the book focuses on an abandoned railway station, but that was, interestingly enough, one of the things I found when I did research. It's always fun to do research, but researching the New York subway system, I found out that before the subway itself was built in the early 1900s, there was
Mhm.
an earlier subway system that was started. And he had built this gigantic station, sort of as a sales, room. And he had
Mhm.
put several miles, and then in the crash of 1873, he lost everything, and the whole process shut down, and
Mm.
it sat there. Well, in this book, shapeshifters, uh, um, people who are different, people who have powers that maybe other, they're looking for a refuge, and they
Mhm.
find it through historical papers. They find this abandoned station, and they
Right.
transform it into this magnificent city. And in fact, two of the early colonists there were involved in the Manhattan Project, and they
Mhm.
developed a nuclear sun that provides power for the entire community.
Mm.
And it's a syndicalist community. It's run by a syndicate, and there's leather workers in there, but they're all different. And the only way
Right.
of getting to it is through this train that has that nobody else is aware of for a variety of reasons, which I hope I explain adequately. But it leaves from a station, again, absolutely true. It leaves from a station that was abandoned in the 1940s and just sits there. So this is
Mm.
where the train comes from, and it goes to this station that really was abandoned in the 1870s. And so it was really fun to create that, and
Mhm.
what they call the market then becomes the center for the resistance to these evil forces outside.
Right.
And so I now got the remaining gem makers after a confrontation that I won't go
Okay.
into, are now at the market, and they say, okay, what now? And
Right.
they know these guys aren't going away. You
Right. So
can't.
you mentioned shapeshifters, and of course you have the gem makers. What other types of lore are you incorporating into your series?
Yeah. Well, for example, the idea of why Barbara goes to find him is to get a chain that's unbreakable, because she's so terrified that she'll lose this gem. And it's the most beautiful thing she's ever seen in her life. And of course,
Right.
it's got part of her soul in it. So she persuades him to tell her how she can find this. And this is a studio that uses metals that no one else works with. They can't. I mean, they developed ways of of almost hypothetical metals that are
Okay.
unbreakable.
Mm.
And in her case, she fits the gem in a setting that has tiny arms around it, but they're all fire because she chooses fire as her element,
Mm.
and each of those can produce a flame of its own. So there's this kind of, there's people who are producing musical instruments that play on their own. I mean, what, like when you walk into this, you hear a bagpipe and way somewhere off in the distance, and so there are people there who are all artisans, and but artisans of a different sort. Like
Sure.
he tries to explain it to her by saying, "Well, look, have you ever seen a contortionist?"
Mm.
And yeah, so well, what could you do what they? Well, no, I mean you've probably seen this too. I mean they seem inhuman.
Right.
Well, there's people like that at all levels, and
Okay.
they're often marginalized and they don't fit. But here they fit. Here they're allowed to be who they are, what they are, and they bring their
Okay.
skill and their
So
talents.
these are it's a town of outsiders.
It's a town of outsiders, but it becomes almost a utopian community.
Yeah. Very cool. So I'm just trying to clarify that, like, you don't have sort of like standard trope, like is there werewolves, vampires, that
No,
kind of stuff? No?
no.
Okay.
And this is what I
Okay.
guess, again, going back to the urban fantasy thing. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted it to be, I wanted it to be believable. I
Right.
wanted people to say, "Jesus, wow, yeah." I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
guess that's part of the problem I have with some of the urban fantasies. I said earlier, it's like, yeah, you're still fighting vampires and you're still doing that.
Okay.
Let's fight
That's very cool.
real
Yeah.
evil forces, and using what's really available to us to some extent. To some extent, I mean, obviously there's a
Sure.
lot of magic, but there's a lot of magic out there we don't understand, right? I mean, that's
Right.
the thing I guess I'm also getting at, and as we go through the book, um, there's a lot of things we don't understand, and this place sort of condenses that
Mm-hmm.
into a center of thought and eventually the center of resistance
Mm-hmm.
to this force that's really trying to particularly in the second book I talk more about Nietzsche's ideas of beyond good and evil,
Okay.
where a group of people that are intended to rule. And so
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that this cabal is promoting this idea in this particular group.
Right.
And so it becomes a much it's a darker stroke. Oh, this one's a bit dark too,
Right.
but I had great fun like taking them over to Hungary and to Budapest, which is
Mm.
to me is a fabulous city. It's kind of a haunted city. It
Mm.
seems like a perfect setting. Um, it's been overrun by every horde, that ever. And
Right.
so there's this tragedy about the country, and you can feel it when you're there. And after World War II, there were these beautiful mansions that were abandoned largely by the
Mm.
Jewish community because of the Jewish suppression. Um,
Right.
and now they've been turned into ruin bars.
Mm.
Have you heard of those?
No, I have not.
They're fascinating. They're like young people said, "Yeah, we don't have no place to go. Screw it. We're going to take this place over," and they
Mm.
did. And so you
Oh,
walk in,
cool.
and things kind of crumbling. And the one we went into, there was an old Volkswagen Beetle in the middle, and
Right.
little kind of side rooms with ancient sofas. And
Cool.
so part of the interaction between uh, when they're trying to figure out what's going on and who's behind this force, he meets with an old agent in this ruin bar, and the old agent is sort of he's an alcoholic, but he relates the story about how the Mester, who may or may not be human, we never really
Mm.
quite determine that,
Right.
is what his origins and that kind of thing. But again, the mystery and
Sure.
the it is a even sort of that feeling of hauntedness, because the
Mm-hmm.
country is haunted by so many tragedies, that the Germans
Mm-hmm.
held it right to the end, 5 years of occupation, and then
Right.
you had the Red Terror after the Bolshevik,
Mm-hmm.
you had the White Terror, and it just goes on and on. The
Right.
the Ottomans
Yeah.
held it.
Well, it really sounds like you've incorporated your life experiences, as well as your love for, as you mentioned, Tolkien and Harry Potter, into this work. And I guess what I'm most curious about is, uh, how informing or how much you draw upon your real life travels when you created this series?
That's a really good question. I mean, as everybody says, you write what you know.
Hmm.
In this case, I chose because, yeah, I mean, when we went to Budapest, I didn't say, oh, I'm going to go there so I can set my book there, but
Right.
I absorbed the city, right, and it really
Hmm.
really registered with me. The Mester is located in an area off Smithfield Market in London, which I loved. I thought that was an incredible area, with
Mm.
all muses and old ancient. So I knew that area, so I incorporated that into it, and using the tubes and how to get around London, and
Hmm.
New York, the same thing, the subways. And so I think, yeah, I think that inevitably you do. In my case, I've been fortunate enough to travel and worked in Africa off and on for 10 years. And so the relationships you have with people, and maybe the brushes you have with magic and
Hmm.
payments, maybe that also comes through, So
Sure.
it certainly it has influenced me tremendously. But having been to these places certainly allows you, I think, I hope, to paint a much more vivid,
Right.
image of where people are. And
Hmm.
um, one woman who I just had to be my sister-in-law, I realized that, so she thought it would really work well as a film because there's enough visual,
Hmm.
stimuli to give it an air, a feeling.
Right. So you've got quite the involved world. How do you keep this all straight? Do you have a wiki, or do you just have like post-it notes all over the place? How
Well,
do you keep track of everything?
I'm a big fan of outlining. You
Oh,
know,
okay.
uh, I mean, if you looked at my outlines, they wouldn't look like much. But
Mm,
I plotted out. The other thing I want to say about this book, Lou, and this is new, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that, as I say, it was 190,000 words, and when I finished it, and
mm,
what publisher is going to take a roll of the dice on 190,000? That's
right.
like that's like 600 or 700 pages, of a relatively unknown writer.
Yeah.
Turns out none. But I hired an editor to work with me. I've never done
Mm,
that before because I went before my publishers have assigned me editors.
hmm.
The whole world of publishing is changing so much.
Right.
And she was such a big help, getting me to if I digressed, if there were distractions, if there, she was
Hmm.
really full in bringing
Hmm.
me back to the storyline and asking the essential questions.
Right.
Don't tell me how did Barbara feel when this happened? So she
Yeah.
kept trying to ground me in the point of view of the characters. And uh,
Right.
so so I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, there was some outlining, and certainly a lot of, I did character sketches of each of the
Hmm.
characters, which I didn't use, but
Okay.
then I had the character in mind and who they were, what their
Hmm.
backgrounds were. That was really helpful to draw on them because now I'm
Right.
a person. Uh,
Okay.
so that kind of thing.
Right. And so you mentioned you had 190,000 words and then you showed it to or you worked with an editor. Did you end up cutting out words?
Well, yeah, I did. First of all, she said, man, this ain't gonna, this is not gonna sell. You're gonna have to cut this down to 120, 100. I tried. I said,
Hmm.
I can't take 60,000 words out of here. I tried. I cut like 10 or 20, which was probably a good thing. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I mean, of course, we all know that every word is irreplaceable and absolutely necessary. But still,
Kill your babies.
but I did manage to trim like 15 or 20,000 words out with her help. Uh,
Okay.
but I said I can't do it. There's no more I can take if the story is going to have any integrity. And
Right.
so that's when I discussed the idea of cutting it in two, which of course you can't just sort of, you can't just take a pair of scissors and cut it in two.
Right.
But it was a good exercise for me again to
Hmm.
see them as two arcs that added up to one larger arc, and it worked quite well. And also, I spent a lot of time working on the transition in the second book, so it can be read as a standalone book,
Okay.
but also as an easy transition from the first.
Right. And your first book, is it available now?
It is, most certainly is. Yeah.
Okay, and it's available at all the usual places,
All the
Amazon, your
places.
website.
My website, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And how long has that book been out?
It came out on May the 21st.
Oh,
So
congratulations. And you're well into your second book?
yeah, it is actually complete. The manuscript is complete. I mean, obviously we'll do some more work on it, and I'm going to be talking to my publishers later this week. They definitely scheduled it for next year, but I'm actually hoping we can get it out earlier than that, and so
Okay.
kind of promote the two together.
All right. And what's the title of the second book?
It's called The Tunnels of Buddha, Buddha,
Ooh,
and
okay.
underneath the castle, Buddha Castle in Hungary, are these ancient tunnels that were inhabited like 400,000 years ago by Neanderthals, as well as all, you know, they were used as torture chambers by different groups. So there's this sort of pall, but they go on for miles and miles, and
Hmm.
so much of the action is played out in these tunnels beneath the Buddha Castle.
Okay. And so where are you with your third book?
Well, I've gotten an idea. The base the um, the market, which as I mentioned is this kind of utopian
Mm-hmm.
world, is located underneath the subway. But there's people, and it's true. I mean, there's a whole population of homeless people living in those subways, and they've already had one confrontation with them, but they managed to reach an accord, and some of those people came in and joined but now, because of the confrontation, the climax of the second book led to a serious setback for the forces of evil. But now the guys who've survived it are now ready to try to figure out where to go next. But
Okay.
it's out that the company, the people that are fomenting this Nietzschean worldview, come to
Mm-hmm.
them and organize the forces beneath the streets of New York in the subways to attack the the market. And so
Okay.
the violence, the attack comes to them rather than them taking it to them.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I am. We'll see where
Cool.
it goes.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions I got for you. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention at this time?
No, I really enjoyed it, Lou. It's been fun to talk to you.
Oh, yeah,
Just,
likewise. A very intriguing premise, and
yeah,
I wish you all the success with the series.
I
And
appreciate it.
just are you thinking of anything beyond this series at this point, or?
And I'm 77. You know? I don't think about anything too
Uh,
long.
well, you don't
Um,
look it, but
no, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I won't go into my heart attack and my prostate.
oh gosh.
All that. Um,
Okay.
no, anyway, I've thought a lot. My work in Africa was transformative for me,
Hmm.
and working with people in remote communities really, really helped me understand. Well, I honestly believe there's an inverse relationship between um, not poverty in the grinding sense, but the generosity of spirit, uh,
Hmm.
the lack of stuff, right? Whereas people with a
Hmm.
lot of stuff seem to be selfish and hoarded. These are the most generous people I've ever met, and my colleagues, and I had such a remarkable. I would like to do something about that, something to 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 make to make the sensibilities of people that we tend to just look at, oh, those poor, those poor starving, wherever they're Ghanaians or
Hmm.
and what they have, and the strength of their communities, uh,
Right.
the strength of their relationships, the marketing that they do, which is really an extension of their community. It's not like you go on Amazon and you can get anything you want tomorrow. I mean,
Right.
you go to a woman who sells tomatoes because she's your uncle's second cousin. You go to the market to do it, but while you do that, you're talking with her and
Hmm.
how's
Yeah.
family doing, and
Yeah.
it,
It's
it's
something
another way.
that's missing in today's world quite a bit. Yeah,
Exactly.
very cool. Well, I have to say, I guess because doing writing at your age is a little bit of a fountain of youth for you. I guess it's always great to have something to look forward to when you wake up the next day that occupies your attention.
And that's no joke. I mean, it's like I'm
Hmm.
very fortunate to have a wonderful family, and I've got two daughters with two grandkids and all that. But the day to
Hmm.
day, this is great, and talking
Yeah,
to you is great. It really. So I mean, that's it's fun to interact
sure,
around.
absolutely. I love talking to writers because everyone's different. Everyone's process is different, and the way they approach their work is different. And but I think at the core of it, there's this burning curiosity that keeps them
Uh,
going, and I can see that in you and a lot of the other writers that I've talked to as well. So. And that in turn energizes me. So it's
Great.
it's a win-win situation for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a great thing that you're doing. That's amazing.
Yes, yes. My little, whatever little piece of help I can do to help writers along is fantastic. And uh,
Absolutely.
with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I wish you all the success with all your future projects.
Thank you very much, Lou, and thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. You take care now. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I will do that.
All righty. Thank you.
You too.
Bye bye.